And thanks everyone for joining us for our grand finale panel. This is really important. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to use the research and perspective of human flourishing to make the world literally a better place? So we have a great discussion coming up. Again, my name is Laura Helmuth. I'm the editor-in-chief at Scientific American. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a minute, but first, I want to share some breaking news, hot off the presses. This is something that happened today. So today, we're going to show you a video from Kigali, Rwanda, where several private and public sector representatives from 6 countries met to establish hubs for the Inner Development Goals, bringing human flourishing tenets to their countries. And so we have a quick video to kind of show what just happened, and then we'll talk about it some more in the panel.
Hello from Kigali, Rwanda. My name is Jan Artem Henriksson. I'm the Executive Director of the Inner Development Goals Initiative. We're a non-for-profit and open source initiative working with governments and big organizations. And at the core, we have the big question of what skills and inner capacities do we all need to develop in order to increase our chances of reaching the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we have more than 1,000 people helping us co-create the framework of the Inner Development Goals. People from MIT, Harvard, Stockholm School of Economics, and practitioners from many big organizations like Google, IKEA, Spotify. And we found 5 dimensions that we think are core. It's the being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting that you see behind us. And 23 skills like empathy and compassion, or presence, or complexity awareness. And we think that if we work on that collectively, we increase our chances of being better leaders and having the capacities needed to collaborate and reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have more than 100 hubs around the world. We have a big yearly conference in Stockholm, and today I'm standing with 2 colleagues, both from research and policymaking, who are initiating new country hubs to work with the Inner Development Goals framework and, of course, human flourishing. Carlos, first you.
Thank you, Jan. I'm Carlos Largacha Martinez from Colombia. I am a researcher from University Ariandina in Bogota. So when I knew about this initiative, I immediately contacted the IDGs. We need this in Colombia because, as you know, we are in a post-treaty process right now, a peace process. And I'm sure that we all Colombians need the 23 skills. We need to develop that. So that's why we are here, and thank you for your invitation.
Thank you, Carlos. Ms. Mayor, please.
Thank you, Jan. My name is Mpasa Mwaya, and I'm the mayor of Kitwe back in Zambia. I'm grateful that I'm here in Kigali attending the IDG conference, and I've learned so far about the 5 dimensions and the 23 skills that are of the Inner Development Goals. And my take-home points for now is that as mayor of the city of Kitwe, I feel it's urgent that I have to create a hub in Kitwe at individual level, and also create hubs at national country level, together with my colleagues that have come here with in Rwanda. But most importantly, right at the local institution where I'm mayor, I need to start this with my councillors, because I realize that with the full realization of the 5 dimensions and the skills, we will be able to serve our residents better, because we'll be having a lot of practice around the Inner Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's sign the letters, and I'm happy to shake your hands to congratulate you to be initiating the new hubs. Welcome, and thank you for doing the important work, Carlos.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Ms. Mayor. Thank you for doing this.
Okay, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the video. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists to begin our discussion. And just a reminder, I know you're familiar with the drill, but please do add your questions to the discussion platform. We'll reserve some time at the end to answer your questions too. So we want to hear what you want to hear about. And so our speakers today for this final panel, we introduce them in alphabetical order by their first names. So our first speaker is Ari Wallach. So he is a futurist and social systems strategist, also the founder and executive director of Longpath Labs, which tries to bring long-term thinking and coordinated behavior to ensure humanity flourishes on an ecologically thriving planet for centuries to come. And he's the author of Longpath, Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs. We also have David Goodhart. So he is the head of Policy Exchange's Demography, Immigration, and Integration unit and the director of the Integration Hub website. He's a former director of Demos and a former editor of Prospect magazine. We have Parth Shah. So he is a founder of the Center for Civil Society and the co-founder of the Indian School of Public Policy, which is a think tank that promotes market and community-based solutions to public policy programs, looking at social change through public policy. And finally, and so the person who is responsible for the video you just saw about the meeting in Rwanda is Thierry Watrin. So he is the Green Economy and Climate Change Advisor to the Minister of State in charge of economic planning in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning for Rwanda. He has more than 10 years of experience across finance, and he has bringing a perspective about green economy and skills for the public and private sectors. So Thierry, would you mind starting us out with, what I'm going to ask all of the speakers is your vision for how human flourishing can be used to make better policy, and maybe specifically tell us a bit more about how the video we just saw came about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. In 2015, in Kigali, the Sustainable Development Goals gave a comprehensive plan for a sustainable world by 2030. The 17 goals cover a wide range of issues that involve people from different needs, different culture, different values, and different convictions. There's a vision of what needs to happen, but progress along this vision has been so far disappointing. And we see it even today with the different COPs and not only SDGs only. We lack the inner capacity to deal with our increasingly complex environment and challenges. Fortunately, modern research shows that the inner abilities we now all need can be developed. And that was actually the starting point for the Inner Development Goal Initiative and the training program that is currently happening in Kigali. So human flourishing through the IDGs, the Inner Development Goals, will provide an essential framework for the policymaker of transformative skills for sustainable development. A field kit, for example, on how to develop the necessary skills can be used and can be proposed as an open source to the policymakers. The current IDGs framework that is used in Kigali represents 5 dimensions and 20 skills. And those are basically qualities that we think are especially crucial for the different leaders that are part of this program that currently happens in Kigali with more than 20 people, senior and leaders from all around the world that just signed letter of intent a few minutes ago, actually, here where I am. So that's why you can hear as well the music in the fund, because we're here actually. So those skills are crucial for leaders, and they will help to address the SDGs. But fundamentally, it can be used for all of us, and the greatest possible accelerator to reach the Sustainable Development Goals and create a prosperous future, not only for developing countries, but for the whole world and the whole humanity.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. And thanks for bringing that to us today. That's exciting to have these overlapping and intersecting events happening right now. Let's see, why don't we go to Ari? Could you tell us a bit about how you see human flourishing being integrated into policy?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here with you all today. What we do at Longpath, and as you kind of read in my intro bio, is we center human flourishing, but we do it in a way that's somewhat different than most organizations, because we look at it through a kind of an intergenerational equity lens. So the question is, how do we allow current generations to maximize flourishing, but not at the expense of future generations' ability to flourish? So the way we think about centering that and what that vision looks like, in some ways, you kind of have this in Wales right now, right? There's a Future Generations Commissioner. There are government bodies that are set up so that when it comes to kind of passing major policy or legislation, you're not just taking into account how that accelerates or maximizes flourishing in the here and now, but also how does it maximize flourishing over the course of several generations? Both how do you maximize it and how do you not degrade the ability? So this is intergenerational equity for those to kind of have that flourishing centered. And I like the response that we just heard as a way of kind of thinking, what are the quantitative and qualitative metrics of flourishing? And we've been hearing that for the past day and a half are unbelievably important. Our vision, though, again, is to kind of center that policy-making process through a long-term lens, right? Multiple generations. And at the same time, in a way that doesn't discount history, right? So a lot of what we do at Longpath is we think about Indigenous and First Nations wisdom and ways of thinking about time and resource management. And those resources may be external, but they may also be internal resources. And we can talk about that later. That's very much kind of our vision, is setting up these policy mechanisms, be it a commissioner or a standing committee. There's a lot of different ways of doing this, be it based if it's a parliamentary system or an executive level system that, again, centers human flourishing, but over long-term intergenerational equity as that kind of way of, in many ways, kind of framing and thinking about it. So that's our vision.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's a good way to be thinking about it today as we try to distill some of the principles from this whole conference. Parth, could you tell us some more about your ideas about flourishing and policy?
It's almost midnight in New Delhi. So let me start with a confession that I know very little about the academic literature on human flourishing.
Okay.
I was fortunate to attend the advisors meeting of the Sir John Templeton Foundation some years back. And I seem to have overheard quite a few conversations over breakfast, lunch, and dinner tables there. So that's my acquaintance with the discipline of human flourishing. Now, keep that in mind as I sort of make the point about public policy and how that can relate to human flourishing. Now, public policy is a democratic political process, right? At least in most countries at most of the times. And it's important to understand that the political community through which this process happens. And I was looking at the literature on human flourishing and looking at what kind of work has been done on and around political communities and the participation in those communities that people would engage in order to lead a flourishing life. And I find there's very little work in that area. And that I see as a sort of important path forward as a new maybe research agenda to talk about public policy and human flourishing, right? Because a political community is a unique sort of community among all communities that I could be part of, right? It's a community which is maybe at this local level, state level, or a national level, members of which I do not actually choose, right? A large proportion of the members I do not even know, right? Despite that, very important elements of my life that could be flourishing life depends on our collective engagement, our collective sort of working together, right? So all the rules, laws, regulations, right, affect what kind of life I will be able to lead in that community. And therefore, what we broadly call public policy. I think there is a need to understand this link between political community and public policy. And I see that as a sort of a good way to sort of move forward on the agenda of understanding the role of public policy and human flourishing.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I feel like, for me at least, a lot of the best things I've learned have been at conference, breakfast, lunches, and dinners, and happy hours, and mixers and stuff. That's a great way to be integrated into this world. David, could you tell us some about your vision for human flourishing and policy?
Well, thanks, Laura. Yeah, I mean, I've been concentrating in the last few years mainly on rich countries, what rich countries have been getting out of kilter. My last book was called Head, Hand, Heart, the Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, which is really arguing that we have been allocating too much reward and status to just one form of human aptitude, the kind of cognitive, analytical, exam passing kind. Important though that is, we tended to neglect the kind of the talents and aptitudes associated with hand and heart, the manual technical skills and caring and emotional work of various kinds. I think, incidentally, that's one of the reasons why, despite rich countries being richer and freer than any countries ever in human history, still have large elements of discontent in them. The kind of discontent that has produced populism and Brexit and Trump, and I'm currently kind of doubling down on this theme and working on a book called Who Cares, basically looking at why it is that rich countries undervalue care work, both in the public economy but also in the private realm. And it is, I think it is part of a broader story about how we put GDP growth before well-being. We tend to privilege freedom and autonomy before kind of longer term forms of satisfaction that are very difficult to measure. And I think we saw a bit in the pandemic. A kind of nostalgia for a certain kind of sort of domesticity that kind of the modern society and the kind of cognitive class that dominates it tends to devalue. Obviously, there are many reasons why care work is undervalued. Obviously, historically, it used to be done for free by women in the gift economy of the family. So there's that sort of historic shadow that hangs over it. But there are all sorts of other reasons to do with little bargaining power. Most care work happens in quite small units, whether it's in the public economy or in the private realm. It's what Nancy Folbrough, the American academic, calls the prisoner of love syndrome. People are not likely to use their leverage against vulnerable old or young people who they're caring for. It's also very difficult to measure and quantify care work, compared to, say, a trader in financial markets, whatever. You can sort of see how much he or she is earning for their firm. What are the how do we raise the status of care in rich societies? I think it's it has to be done partly through changes of values and changes of priorities. And I think this is happening, and it's happening rather slowly. But as rich societies age, we're going to need more and more people to go into elder care, amongst other things. The dementia nurse is unfortunately one of the great jobs of the future. Obviously there are lots of jobs in the care economy that are very well paid. If you're a medical consultant, whatever, but it's these sort of Cinderella sectors that we have to raise the status of. And I think in the domestic realm, I think we should count domestic activities in GDP. If we are trying to measure what's of value in the economy, then just like environmentalists criticize GDP for the fact that it's counting lots of bad things and not counting lots of good things, we should do the same when it comes to domestic labor. And I think because there is a growing fertility gap in almost all rich countries and lots of middle-income countries now. The fertility rate is well below replacement. All rich countries, it's below replacement, and an increasing number of even poor countries, it's now falling below replacement level. So the world is going to face a kind of population crunch over the next few decades. And I think one of the regrettable side effects of that, in some ways, is that rich countries, which have even more of a population crunch, are taking more and more of the kind of brightest and best people from poor countries, and those people are not therefore in the poor countries helping them to get richer. And I think but actually, lots of parents in rich countries want to have more children than they are actually having. There is this so-called fertility gap between the number of children we're having and the number of children people want.
Great. Yeah. So we do have some good questions from the audience. People in the audience, please keep sending them in. We'll be sure and save some time for your questions. There's some good ones. So thanks, David. I love the title of your book, Who Cares? That's really catchy. One of the great advantages of having, the four of you here from different parts of the world with different sets of expertise is that we can learn from one another, and people in the audience can learn hopefully from one another as well. And so I wanted to ask each of you to kind of share out what's possible, an example of some sort of policy, big or small, that you think is something that works, is a solution, is something that people around the world should maybe look to emulate for inspiration, for ideas. And I won't call on you in order. Some of you may have something top of mind, maybe not. So please jump in if there's anything you want to just call out that you think people in the audience really ought to know about. That's a good idea.
I'll start. It's a good idea in that it's both kind of a noun and a verb. And let me explain. So there's a professor that he's in my book, and we're going to be working with him in the future. He has something. He's in Japan. He has something called future design. And so what they do is when they move into a community to help them think about how they want to do kind of community planning and policy development, whatever that is, anything that includes a budget, let's say. One of the things he does is he has a certain number, usually 10 to 15% of the people who come to these kind of citizen assemblies, right, don these very specific ceremonial robes. And there's these golden, beautiful robes. And what the robes do is they basically make who's ever wearing these robes a proxy for future generations. So whereas, 85% of the people in the room will say, oh, we should build this, we should do that. Again, I'm being very generic, whatever that is, those who are wearing these kind of ornate, robes, they don't have to be ornate, but these robes, their job in many ways is to say, oh, that's a great idea. That will lead to kind of flourishing in the moment. But what about what will there be the ramifications of that over the next several decades, right? And so in the sense, they become a proxy. Another way of doing that, if you don't want to do the robes, is what some folks call youth quotas. So basically bringing the future into the room. So more often than not, policy is set, at least in the global north, by people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and increasingly 70s here in the States. And so by bringing youth in at a quota level, and I know that's a big debate topic, but what that looks like is you are ensuring that folks who will then be kind of, in many ways, on the receiving end of that policy over the next several decades are in the room to actually weigh in. And there's this misconception, and in some ways, David touched on this, around kind of power and age denotes a certain level of wisdom. And I want to kind of turn that on its head and say there is wisdom in youth, and kind of youth being involved in these discussions. So be it either the robes, so for those who are in the room to take that kind of proxy for future generations is something that's amazing. And we're starting to do that in the States at local government level, or make ensuring that youth is in the room, not like at the last COP where it's a tent off on the side while the people in the 70s and 80s hammer out agreements, but literally at the table in those conversations. So those are two ways of kind of implementing at a process level, and ensuring human flourishing, both for the here and now and for future generations, is at the table.
And those are fun ideas. That's great. Thank you. Anybody else want to share some things that you find inspiring?
Can I have I've got a slightly more prosaic ideas. One of the things that we suffer from increasingly in rich societies, I think, is generational divide. I mean, that young people just not knowing, particularly with much smaller families, not really knowing, often not really having grandparents, because people have babies so much later. And the generations hardly ever meet. And I think we should incentivize young people to work in elder care homes. Perhaps in the way that people sometimes go on a gap year, between school and university, or incentivize people with discounts to their university fees, or the equivalent to people who aren't going to college. And another. Obviously, one of the reasons why we have this kind of collapse in fertility in rich countries is because women increasingly, find it very hard to combine career and raising families. And indeed, as the American economist Amy Wax put it, that care is undersupplied because basically it has positive externalities, positive benefits for society and indeed households that the caregiver cannot capture. And society used to solve that problem by preventing women from doing pretty well anything else. We've now lifted that constraint largely, and we're kind of left with the problem. So we've got to make it easier for parents, mothers and fathers, to combine working life with raising children. And I think one way you can do that is by giving childcare subsidies that at the moment tend to be paid directly to nurseries. You know, you get, in the UK, you have kind of 30 hours free childcare for any kid over for 3-year-olds, I think it is. Well, why not give those subsidies direct to families, and then they can make the choice? It may be that they'd want to keep the money for themselves, so the mother or the father could stay at home, and make it easier to stay at home, or use grandparents or whatever. Just give people more choice in how they arrange these matters.
Thanks. See, Parth or Thierry, go ahead.
So maybe I can share some work that has been done in India, and could be sort of one way to think about what can be done in public policy space. So much of the work that has been done in India is focused on personal and economic freedom. So in more practical terms, we focus on dignity, agency or choice, and community. So there are 3 sort of key areas that we focus on in terms of the work that's done in the policy domain. So let me give an example of each of the 3 sort of areas very briefly. So if you want to be a street vendor, a hawker in India, you need a license to be so. The licenses are very limited in number and very difficult to get. So most of the hawkers that you see on the streets of India, and there are millions and millions of them, are unlicensed. What that means is they are open to harassment and extortion by the police, by the municipal officers, and there's a constant threat on their livelihood because of it. So what happens legally, the police would declare them as a public nuisance, and then they'll be threatened to sort of vacate the place. Now, what the policy work that happened is created a new Street Vendor Act. And the act basically put the responsibility of proving that a particular vendor is a public nuisance on the government officers. And we hope that officers are not as hardworking, and they would do less of the paperwork required to declare these hawkers as public nuisance, and thereby ask them to evacuate. So that's sort of one example of how dignity plays an important role in thinking about public policy and economic freedom. Right? Maybe one more example of agency or choice. So there's a Right to Education Act that was passed in 2010 in India. Right? Now in the act, there are 25% seats being reserved in all private schools for economically and socially weaker sections. Right? We call them EWS, in a sense, economic and socially weaker sections. And so now these seats, which are available to poor parents for the children in all these private schools, the fee for these seats are actually paid by the government. And therefore, there's a huge degree of choice and agency available to poor parents to choose a school they want to send the children to. I think in some ways, this is probably the largest school voucher program in the world. So I think that's other way of sort of giving agency to people, choice to them in terms of what they want to achieve in their life. And certainly those are the ways in which we can expand community sort of engagement more, provide more dignity and choice, and thereby see how public policy can play a role in the larger realm of human flourishing.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. It's lovely to hear all these creative solutions. Thierry, did you want to add anything, or should we move on to the next?
I actually do. I have a lot to say. The 3 examples were very interesting. And somehow, if you take a global picture of all the examples we had from David, Harry, and as well the example of dignity in India, is how can we change the process of learning paradigm? what we see is that historically, the global north was teaching to the global south the values and how to develop economically. The examples that was given by David is really interesting about the role of the grandparents in the society. Because if you go in most of the African countries, the grandparents are central. What people do in the weekend, they gather around the grandparents and they discuss and they learn from them. The example that Eric gave about the youth in political leader positions, you have it as well in Africa and especially in Rwanda, where you have more than 50% of the population that's under 30. So as a matter of fact, when you look at the ministries and the people in position of power in different institutions, they're rather young. And if you look at the COP27 Rwanda team, for example, which I was part of, we're young, we're all young, it's a very young team. So what I think is that we arrived to a point where we've seen the limits of the ideology that were linked with the development of the global north and a carbonized economy. Now it's maybe time to say, okay, what can we learn as well from different culture and different developments in economies? And how do you see that in Africa or in Latin America, countries like Costa Rica, that put really forward the well-being and the environment at the center of the economy and developed it around that? How can we learn from that? And how can we use those human flourishing qualities, put them back in our political leadership process, and come back to what's more human at the end?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
So am I allowed to chip in there? I think it's a really good point about the respect for old people in Africa and Asia. I mean, one of the curious things about our aging European societies is that the older they get, the less visible old people become. You know, the public culture is incredibly dominated by young people, and we have well, as you know, we have a large South Asian minority in the UK. Who do bring with them those different attitudes. Funnily enough, I was talking to a very, very senior person in our health department a few months ago, and I asked a typical sort of journalist question, you know, if there was one thing you could do to relieve the pressure on the National Health Service, what would it be? And they came up with a much more interesting reply than I expected. They said, I would want the same kind of moral, legal, and financial support for elderly people that people have for their young children. Because we behave disgracefully towards our old people. And it'd be interesting to see over time whether the South Asian practice, where they don't send their old people into old people's homes, they look after them in multi-generational households, whether some of that might sort of seep into the rest of society, or, as I suspect, it'll actually be the other way around, and they will be corrupted by our disregard for the elderly.
So one of the questions from the audience is about, it's a meta question. It's a little bit about how can we take what we're talking about in these 2 days about human flourishing and help other people understand it. And the question specifically is about education. And do you have ideas about how to help people, you know, in informal school systems, so young people in school, but also people throughout the life course, how to help people kind of understand what the factors are that contribute to human flourishing and how to support them and spread them along?
But I think a priority of kind of figuring out how to distribute those factors and have people thinking about it, this goes back to what David and Parth and Thierry said, is how do you center human flourishing first and foremost? So what we know about education, again, coming from the States, it's very much based on this carbon economy, kind of farming. We all go off to the farm. That's how everything in around the education system here in the States is 100 to 150 years old. So if we want to move from a GDP to, let's say, a gross happiness, you know, like we have in Bhutan, or a gross flourishing product, I think first and foremost, we have to have the conversation of what is it that we want to center? And if we want to center human flourishing, which I know as an organization we do, but if we want to have that conversation first, and when we have that conversation first, then everything kind of leads from there. And as anyone who's studied modern management theory, what you can measure is what you manage towards. And so what we've seen over the past day and a half is a rethinking about not, moving human flourishing from this almost qualitative, high level kind of conversation, almost new agey, to something that's much more grounded, something much more real. So it's us kind of jumping across the chasm from taking human flourishing that seems kind of romantic and poetic, and really deciding as a society, wherever you want to locate your society, and saying, we want to center this, then and we want to center it, and we can measure it, because that's still kind of in the cognitive class, to use David's term, like that's still something that we're going to have to work with. So working with that, then moving backwards and saying, okay, now that we have centered this, we now need to actually prioritize this. And then I think that leads into the question of like, how do we do it? But before we can even get to the how, we have to center the ethos of it, because that's what's going to kind of take it over the finish line.
That's great. Thank you. And just in case anybody's watching the clock, we do have a few more minutes since there's so much to talk about and it's a big panel. Yeah, go ahead, please, Parth.
Yes, no, I was going to say that, in the part of education system that I'm much more engaged with is the Indian School of Public Policy, which is a postgraduate or graduate program. And I just realized that there's hardly any discussion that we have in the policy school about human flourishing as any meaningful way of assessing how well the policies are doing. So maybe one way to sort of start thinking about human flourishing and public policy is to introduce some of these ideas in policy schools. And that could be, I think, two things, right? One, that the students in the schools would do research and probably do some risk pilot programs, which will be a good way to sort of test what Ari has been talking about, bringing the ideas of human flourishing from the sky a little bit closer to the earth, in a sense, right? And also, I think we would find out maybe after 2 or 3 years of the graduation, how useful this approach has been, what they have been able to implement, what has inspired them to do various things they did in their professional career, and see whether the ideas and the sort of thinking around human flourishing has played any significant role. That would also be for us to assess how much are we able to bring the ideas to the ground and to make a difference in lives of people.
That's great. Great. Well, it's been wonderful thinking about this, talking about this. It's been really a pleasure to think about how can we make small, big, short-term, long-term, extremely long-term, generations away long-term improvements to society to foster human flourishing. It's really been inspiring to hear from all of you. Looking forward to keeping up with your work in the future, and really grateful to the organizers of the conference for bringing us all together. So thanks so much, and thanks very much to everybody in the audience for your attention and for your interest in this important subject.